独门绝技龙抬头。不，这程度已经不能叫龙抬头了，是龙回头了。
Since you clicked on this video, you probably know what Rebound is. But for those who don't, for whatever reason, Rebound refers to when a unit has a long backswing, so that when they're knocked back, they can, well, rebound back and immediately attack the enemy again, hence the namesake. But since there's a lot of nuance behind Rebound that might not immediately be obvious, I'm gonna go through it in depth and you cannot stop me. So how and why does Rebound work? I mentioned this in my video about frame data forever ago, so if you want to skip ahead, here's a timestamp for your convenience. It's also marked in the chapters. Anyway, Rebound happens when most or all of a unit's TBA is comprised on backswing, which is the part of the attack animation after the attack has already landed instead of idle time, when the unit just stands around and can move forward. This is typically but not always paired with fast speed and or high knockback count. To compare these differences, we can look at Super Feline 2 and True Super Feline. They have almost the same TBA. However, Super Feline 2 has 24 frames of backswing and 41 frames of idle time, whereas True Super Feline has 67 frames of backswing and 0 idle time, meaning that it will immediately attack once the animation is finished. So, comparing the two, knocking back the enemy will mean that Super Feline 2 moves forward, but True Super Feline stays in place. Now, what if they're knocked back during the TBA? Well, Super Feline 2 will still rebound back, but it won't be able to immediately attack again because it's still in idle time. Meanwhile, True Super Feline will be able to skip its backswing and start burning through its idle time, and since it has none, he'll immediately attack again. This is the most well-known property and the namesake of Rebound. Most famously, Rebound can be used to amplify a unit's offense within a very short span of time. By bypassing their backswing, which comprises most of a Rebound unit's TBA, it massively amplifies their damage output. In exchange, however, they need to get hit by either big damage or knockback ability to skip their backswing, which means they're taking damage. These Rebound rushers also typically have very low health, which means that this will accelerate their damage output, but also cause them to die very quickly. This is usually a fairly good trade-off though if they take down a key enemy with them, or at least heavily cripple them so the rest of the lineup can clean up. That said, while it does enable damage to be dealt really quickly, the total amount of damage usually isn't quite enough to fully kill the enemy, especially in later stages of the game. So you might not always want to rely on this backswing-resetting playstyle. As a matter of fact, you can use an entirely different property of Rebound to use a completely different playstyle. The property in question is that when a unit is in their backswing, they do not move forward. This may not be as flashy as negating their TBA, but in my opinion, it's far more important. This single property enables the playstyle of chaining, which is one of the best, most fun, and skill-expressive playstyles in the game. Chaining can be used on most enemies up to about 400 range or so, but it works best on enemies with decent force swing, at least 1.5 seconds, but the longer the better. Basically, the essence of chaining is to try to make your Rebound rusher survive as long as possible. dealing their vastly above average DPS over a longer period of time. There are so many things that are important that all converge into this one strategy, spanning across many facets of the game. The basic idea is that you trap the enemy in a loop, preventing them from hitting your rebound rusher. The loop is as follows. The enemy is knocked back by your rusher, spending 25 times in knockback animation, then spends more time walking back up, then has to restart their force swing. It doesn't sound like a lot, but all of this time will add up. And it's usually enough for your rebound rusher to finish their backswing and hit the enemy again. However, one hit usually isn't quite enough to knock the enemy back in most later game stages, so you'll also have to buy enough time to land that second hit. How do you do this? Well, you can freeze the enemy at any part of the process to halt the enemy's advance, or slow it during the time it's walking back up. You can also make the enemy miss their attack by timing a meat shield just after it gets knocked back, so that the enemy hits the meat shield and not your rusher. This works only because of rebound. Since they're in the backswing, your rusher doesn't walk straight back into the attack and get themselves killed. This meat shield doesn't even have to be a meat shield in the conventional sense. It just needs to be something that enters the enemy range fast enough. I personally use Bullet Train a lot for this. Not a conventional meat shield by any means, but I can time it straight into the enemy's attack to prevent it from hitting my Bahamut. You can also use more knockback to restart this process and buy a lot more time. Your objective here is to keep this up for as long as your rusher lives, so using Weaken to further augment your rusher's health is also great here. Using these techniques, you can sustain a rusher for surprisingly long. For reference, in a clear of Heavenly Tower floor 40 that I did on stream, I was able to sustain Bahamut for 26 seconds. Which, for reference, was 7 attacks, much more than a standard backswing-resetting playstyle would allow. Even in this less optimal Infernal Tower floor 30 run, I was able to land 4 hits on Masked Grandmaster, whereas most unsupported Bahamuts would only be able to land 1 to 2. Especially nowadays where we have insanely OP rushers like Baja Blast, level 60 Yukimura, Sonic the Hedgehog, Kozuchi Maru, and also tons of rusher supports like Thunderbolt, Breaker Blast, Skanda. Getting the most bang for your Bahamut is not only incredible because every hit deals over 200k damage, but also fairly easy. Now for some theoretical analysis. Rebound is a defensive property that is placed on most offensive units. By extending the lifespan of your offensive units, this allows you to deal the same amount of DPS but over a longer period of time, increasing overall long-term DPS. In a sense, all these measures about chaining are about further extending this duration of increased damage output. And in that sense, it turns would-be defensive mechanics into offensive ones. And even further than that, knockback is a defensive mechanic, which means this high offensive power will then induce further defensive value via damage knockback, which will in turn induce even more offensive value. Wait, isn't this the multiplier effect from real economics? Well, likewise to the real-life multiplier effect, a single knockback doesn't quite generate enough defensive value to sustain it indefinitely, so it will eventually end in your rusher getting killed, but not before the value is multiplied. This is an incredibly powerful effect as you'd expect, allowing you to easily recoup your initial investment and then some. Other than rebound units, there's also rebound enemies. They are sometimes used similarly to how we players use rebound units, but most of the time they actually aren't, because units and enemies operate under different rules. Naturally, this is a topic for another video, but to briefly cover the relevant parts, because the player has agency to hard counter the stage, they have an inherent advantage. To counteract this immense advantage, enemies get insanely high stats and OP combinations that units cannot dream to have. Some rebound enemies are used the same way as our rebound units, like brawler variants who aim to deal as much damage as possible to your army before dying. The difference is that since Ponos can't easily time enemies to support them, as the correct timing depends on the exact circumstances happening at that precise moment, they can't really benefit from the aforementioned multiplier effects, so they go for a literal multiplier, by which I mean they spam them. But in my opinion, the more interesting rebound enemies are the bulky ones that have big Omni Strike, which is to say, Puffington variants and Kuro Croc, which forces you to limit your offense. You can't just spam attackers willy-nilly lest your entire army gets obliterated. Floor 47 is an iconic stage for the Puffington C Moneko combo, where Puffington forces you to accurately control your offense, while C Moneko forces you to accurately control your defense. It's honestly a really fun stage, and it showcases how dynamic a rebound enemy can be if utilized well. Rebound also isn't limited to rushers. It's most associated with rushers as it's the most noticeable on them and also hence namesake. But the property itself of TBA composed of primarily backswing is much broader and isn't limited to just rushers. It's just an excellent property to have in most cases. As I said, rebound is a defensive mechanic, often used on suicide rushers to generate more offense, but it also can be used on more traditional offensive and supportive units too. Units like Pizza, Housewife, Seafarer, and on the Uber side, Vigler, both Mitamas, both Castleys, both Fornoas, etc. None of these units are rushers, but they all use rebound really well. That defensive property of not moving forward until you're ready to attack is also great for survivability generally, meaning that they don't risk speed clipping nearly as much. Additionally, it does mean that if a unit is knocked back, they'll immediately attack again and provide their damage or their support. For a unit like Mitama, if she gets knocked back, she will immediately rebound and reapply the slow to prevent them from pushing even further, which is part of what makes her so elite. It's just a really good property in general. Although it's not good on every unit, Rebound is excellent on units that you want to not take too much damage so that they can continue providing value over time. But if, ironically, that value in question is to take damage for your other units, then they won't move forward to protect your units, and so they don't function that well. That's why most meat shields and tanks just don't have rebound. It is actively contradictory to their playstyle. But for example, take Shigong. Shigong doesn't really have rebound per se, but he does have a really long attack animation, meaning that for the purposes of this point, it's close enough. Do you see how Shigong always takes a bit before moving forward? Sure, Shigong themselves may live longer, but the point of Shigong is to absorb damage for everyone else, and if everyone else moves forward while he's just standing there hitting the ground, then he won't really be protecting them. And that gets in the way of providing his value. It's not a deal breaker, obviously, but it is annoying. I think that's about all, actually. This is a shorter video. Rebound itself is popular mechanic. Many of the most popular units have Rebound, and Rebound itself contributes a huge portion of that unit's power. It creates some of the most interesting units, enemies, and stages, and frankly one of the best displays of the sheer depth that this game has to offer, as it creates some of the coolest content that this game has to offer, all before implementing an actual ability. It's really fun to play against, strategize with, and overall just excellent for the game. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Check out my other stuff if you want. Like this video about knockback or this video about frame data where I mentioned Rebound in both videos. But in any case, see you next time, and until then, don't die.